I'm Phil Klay. I'm the author of Redeployment, a book of short stories about the Iraq War. I'm also a Marine Corps veteran of Iraq, here with Eric Fair. I think, not sure what year I met you. It was a couple years, maybe
2012,
2012, yeah, a couple years after I got out of the Marine Corps. And you showed up at a veterans writing workshop and that was run by NYU. Whole group of veterans, mostly Iraq and Afghanistan vets, who were writing stories, writing memoir, writing articles. And you started out actually writing fiction, a lot of very sort of surreal fiction, often dealing with kind of disconnect and people working through guilt.
It was interesting. I'd gotten involved in that group. I'd been writing op-eds, so I'd been doing mainly personal essay. And so I'd shown up to I'd read something. I think someone else had written something that was published in the New York Times and had mentioned the NYU group. And so I took an interest in it. And even though I wanted to improve sort of my op-ed and essay writing, I got in there and sort of experimented with fiction, which is something I hadn't done. I think in some ways, because of the topic we're going to talk about, it kept me safe and insulated from my own experience.
Well, and I'm not sure when it was that I learned that you'd written op-eds about torture, about your experience with that. I know that when members of the group found out, you were worried that people would no longer talk to you.
Yeah, well, it was a huge. When I first started writing about torture in 06 and 07, I was cut off from many of my friends and my colleagues that I'd worked with. So my fear was that I'd get back into that vet writing group and the exact same thing would happen. And the opposite happened. I mean, I was embraced by that group, and it was an important step for me.
Well, I think we thought it was an important topic to discuss, and glad that somebody was writing about it honestly and rigorously. I guess we should talk a little bit about your background. You're from a former steel town. Right.
Yeah, so born and raised in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which was essentially a dying steel town. I grew up there in the 80s, so it was still, the blast furnaces were still going at that point, but the writing was on the wall. Yeah. We all knew that it was closing, like many of the steel industries.
Now they've
United
turned
States.
The steel mill into a casino.
Yes, the Sands Casino has moved in, and they just got table games. So yeah, they're doing well. I'm not sure the city's seeing much of the money, but yeah, born and raised in Bethlehem, and a strong Scottish Presbyterian background, which was pretty common. In that area, a lot of Presbyterian churches.
Yeah, and you were very much involved with the church.
I was, yeah. The place was a sanctuary for me, both figuratively and literally. School was difficult, middle school and high school, and so the church was really a safe place for me that took care of me, and where I really was introduced to some people who challenged me and really pushed me along, not just to sort of be involved in the church and games and whatnot, but to really sort of understand Scripture and read theologians, and even to be involved in current events and what was going on around me.
Well, I mean, I think that's one of the interesting things in the book. You deal with that aspect of your background, and of course, your relationship to your faith is not unrelated to the decisions that you make that actually set you on a path towards going to Iraq and becoming an interrogator at Abu Ghraib. You first were in the Army. Right, you were trained as an Arabic linguist, but this was in the 90s.
Yeah, so I enlisted in 1995. A means to an end. At that point, growing up in the Presbyterian Church, you're often introduced to this sense of calling, and so this is the idea that God calls you to a specific path. And for a number of reasons, which are explored in the book, I felt called towards law enforcement. And in the mid-'90s, it was difficult to get into local law enforcement, and one of the advantages you could gain was to join the military and get veterans preference. Now, this was 4 or 5 years after the first Gulf War. There was a little fighting in Bosnia, but it was mainly being done from the air. And I think at that point in the mid-'90s, the vast majority of people, the Cold War was winding down. There was no sense that the U.S. Army was going to be involved in any kind of ground combat, not only anytime soon, but possibly ever. There was even talk then that war had changed forever in the future, and that there would never actually be ground fighting. So it's not to suggest that I wasn't willing to do those things, but my intent was never sort of a calling towards the military.
Right.
So I spent my 5 years and then was hired as a police officer in Bethlehem.
Right. You worked in Bethlehem. You were interviewing to be an analyst with the CIA, right? And then 9/11 happens, and that changes things.
Yeah, so I retained an interest. I'd been an Arabic linguist, as you said, and I'd gotten my security clearance. And so all sorts of doors were open for me within the government. But again, it didn't look like anything interesting was going on in the Middle East, other than sort of some brush fire type issues. So again, my focus was on the police department. Now, what ended up happening in 2002 is I was diagnosed with a heart condition. I was not symptomatic. I had just gone for a physical. I was actually applying for the DEA, and they discovered a heart murmur, and one thing led to another, and it ended my law enforcement career. Now, this was post 9/11, and at this point, the war was beginning to really wind up in Iraq, and part of it was I just wanted to continue to be involved in that kind of community. But then I think another level that there was kind of a sense of a national call to service post 9/11. And certainly for someone like me who'd been a veteran, who'd been an Arabic linguist, I felt not only a desire to do that, but a sense of obligation.
And you thought, you actually thought when you were applying for jobs, particularly given your heart condition, that, there'd be tons of candidates, you wouldn't get it.
Yeah, I was under the impression that, I certainly thought the recruiting offices would just be flooded with applicants. And I thought the same for these more competitive positions, whether it was intelligence analyst for a contracting company or working for the NSA or the CIA. I thought after 9/11, and I think like many people did, that it would be very competitive to get into those positions. I was shocked by just how easy it was.
Right.
I was hired. I'd taken a job with the National Security Agency, but then was hired within just a week or two after taking that job by a contractor, CACI, C-A-C-I, and they had me deployed within about 3 or 4 weeks of that initial phone call.
Right. Now, you get there, there's an overwhelming amount of work, an overwhelming amount of people coming through. And you talk about sort of the first steps towards using more coercive methods in interrogation. One thing that I think is interesting in the book is the first time that kind of moral question comes up about the use of force is not in Iraq and it's not in Abu Ghraib. It's when you're a police officer.
Yeah, I think in general, the use of force, there is a compassionate way. There's certainly a compassionate way to be a police officer. In fact, being a police officer is one of the most compassionate jobs you can have. You're often dealing with people who are in the greatest moment of crisis in their lives, whether it's a domestic dispute or an overdose or even something simple like a car accident. And the use of force it can be used compassionately, right? You can protect people with use of force, and you can even protect people from themselves. What I found was I ended up arresting a young man he was a heroin addict. He and his wife were divorced. They'd lost their house that he had lived in Bethlehem. And at some point he had broken back into this empty house and was squatting in the house. A new couple bought the house. They called us to essentially take him out. And we went in and we used force on him to forcibly remove him from the home. Now, I didn't find out until later that I had him in the back of my squad car that he was essentially an old acquaintance of mine from Liberty High School. And that was certainly I'd used force before, but it was the first indication to me that even by using force compassionately, or at least justifiably, he certainly justifiably needed to be removed from that home, that I'd injured him and that I'd hurt him, and that this was someone I knew who had had a really challenging, difficult life. And so it was very difficult at that point to square the idea of my own Christian beliefs of compassion with using force.
And then you're in Iraq. You're at Abu Ghraib. The first time you mention laying hands on a prisoner, right? And I think it's important to talk about this. And the way that you paint it in the book is something very widespread, right? After the Abu Ghraib scandal, there was a lot of talk about a few bad apples, right? But you could hear what was happening in other interrogation booths when you're interrogating people, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and I think one of the keys with the book is what I don't want to do is turn this into a book about policy, right? So
Yeah.
I did not write about the policy of interrogation, of enhanced interrogation techniques. The use of force and the use of enhanced interrogation, or at least what we used to call enhanced interrogation, which I think we all now agree is torture, was widespread because it was policy. We were not doing these things. The doors were closed, but there were two-way mirrors. People saw this stuff going on. None of us were doing these things hoping that we wouldn't get caught. And so many of us were shocked when the Abu Ghraib scandal did break, not so much by the activity that we saw, but by the reaction of not just the American people, but the American leaders. And the idea that interrogation had otherwise been this very clean and sort of compassionate process, but only a few of these guys had sort of gone off the rails. When in fact, what you were seeing in those photos, certainly some of that stuff had gone outside the bounds of what was legally allowable. But in general, that was a daily occurrence at Abu Ghraib.
How early did you have a sense that there was something morally wrong?
I'm sorry?
How early did you have a sense of that there was something morally wrong going on?
Well, again, and some of this goes back to my own Christian beliefs. The idea that working in a jail, in any jail, is a really difficult thing to square with Christian values. In large part because anytime God shows up in Scripture in a prison, He's always on the side of those being detained. He is always on the side of the prisoner, as opposed to the jailer. And so stepping inside a prison like Abu Ghraib, just the sheer number and the vast number of detainees, it was immediate. I mean, it was kind of like a smack in the face that morally this was going to be something that I was probably going to spend the rest of my life kind of dealing with, whether or not I was the right side or the wrong side. To say nothing of interrogation, to nothing of torture, just the very act of detaining thousands of Iraqis in their own country was, it was morally difficult.
And at the same time, you felt a moral imperative because there was a tremendous amount of violence going on, right? And you know, probably, among all the people that you're interrogating, some of these people are involved or have information, right?
Sure.
When was the first time you feel like you crossed a line?
Yeah, I get asked that question a lot. And I think if you could probably go back and look at interviews I've given, I probably give different answers. In some ways, I may have crossed the line the day I took the job with the contractor, the day I left for Iraq. There's an incident in the book that certainly stands out. A young man had been captured with a large number of car batteries. He'd been brought in. People were detonating IEDs with car batteries. They were using that as the power source at the time. And we brought him in for an interrogation, and he denied it, and he said that he used them for fishing. They essentially would electrocute the lakes. The fish would be stunned, rise to the top, they'd gather the fish. And I thought that was ridiculous. And so I did lay hands on him and shoved him and used some of what were then being called enhanced interrogation techniques. And that was, I knew even then, as I was doing these things, that I had crossed the line. Now, the interrogation worked, and
Right.
he did give up information that eventually led to the the discovery of what was then being called a VBIED, a vehicle-borne improvised explosive device, a factory with cars and bombs and foreigners who were driving these vehicles. So in some sense, it was a successful interrogation, and the use of these techniques and the use of torture had been effective. But certainly from my own moral compass at that point was just completely thrown out of whack.
And yet in the time, you probably felt exultant.
Yes, absolutely. I was thrilled. It was like anything, it was an enormous adrenaline rush. And even today, there's a part of me that still thinks that was completely justifiable, and it's something I should have written a different book. I should have written the book about how I tortured these guys and got information and saved American lives. But you can certainly look at Iraq now, and in the general scheme of things, no matter what torture may have accomplished in the sort of that micro sense, the macro look at Iraq, I think, without question, suggests that it was an utter failure.
Well, it seems that whatever intelligence came out of Abu Ghraib, whether it was good intelligence or bad intelligence, set aside the effectiveness of an individual case, that what happened there certainly alienated the Iraqis and made
absolutely. And I think you can certainly suggest that I could have applied different techniques with that young man and gotten not necessarily the same information, but possibly better information.
Right.
And he may have walked out of that interrogation feeling better about having been captured by Americans. So certainly not thrilled, but the idea that they were compassionate and it was a safe place and it was the country that he had heard of. I'm not saying that would have worked, but that's the kind of thing that we certainly needed to be doing.
And the other thing that happened was you went on, and the next time you found people with car batteries who said they were fishing, you assumed that they were lying.
Yes, I tortured other people with the exact same capture report, essentially, and found that they were being completely honest. And someone who I think he was from Georgia, an American, had said, yes, of course they fish with car batteries. I used to do it. And so that was, I think I probably recognized that I crossed the line the first time, but that realization that I had tortured people for absolutely no reason who were being completely honest was certainly a point at which I knew I would never return from.
That was happening not at the hard site. You talk about the hard site at Abu Ghraib.
Right. So there was the hard site where what they were calling then high-value detainees were held. So people that were captured that had been they'd famously put out a deck of cards with all the very sort of the most important names in Saddam's regime. And so if someone from the deck of cards had been captured, they'd have ended up at the hard site. The hard site was a much smaller facility, whereas the outdoor camps were holding thousands. The hard site might have been maybe 100. I'm not sure of the name, but the hard site, and I only had one introduction to the hard site. Was where I think some of the more advanced, if there is such a word, enhanced interrogation techniques were taking place. Again, blatant torture, no denying it. But all of this stuff was within this sort of enhanced program.
Right. I'll read a section from the book, maybe describing that. This is one paragraph. The hard site is a two-tiered building with an open bay running down the middle, allowing full view of all the cells. As Stefanowitz leads me into the building, I see naked men. There are naked men in the cells, naked men handcuffed to chairs outside the cells, naked men standing in lines. There's a man on the floor who's being told to get naked. When he refuses, someone grabs him by his pants and drags him along the floor on his back. The pants come off and he's naked. The hard side is cold. Stefanowitz waits while I return to the IC to retrieve my jacket. Now, on the page right before that, you get a speech from a first sergeant about interrogation, and he talks about the need to be creative. And he gives the example of a German interrogator in World War II.
Hans Scharf.
Yeah. Could you explain a little bit about it?
So Scharf famously interrogated downed American and presumably British pilots. And he was fluent in English, and actually he had traveled in the United States prior to the war. So it was very easy for him to speak to these downed American pilots. And he was famous for holding essentially dinner conversations with these men, taking them on walks in the forest and getting to know them, and not asking any sort of direct questions about what attack was coming, but through these conversations, he just gained incredible amounts of intelligence about the capabilities of American aircraft, of weaponry, of tactics, those types of things. And even after the war, some of these American pilots who had been interrogated by Scharf actually invited him back to the United States for Christmas dinner to celebrate with him. And eventually Hans Scharf became an American citizen and then taught interrogation training to U.S. military personnel.
Now, I think it's really interesting to look at an example like that, particularly because that first sergeant tells you to get creative, uses him as an example, and then tells you to talk to this guy at the hard site, right? Which is the polar opposite of that style of interrogation. And, the thing when I look at this is, with coercive techniques, with torture, you usually get one answer, right, that you're looking for very directly. And it might not even be the true answer. It might be somebody just telling you what they want, what they think you want to hear. What he was getting was the whole sort of complicated web of knowledge that these people he was interrogating had, right? And despite the fact that we know that the real utility from a lot of interrogation is not necessarily from a ticking time bomb scenario that you see on TV shows, that's really something that mainly happens on TV shows. There's this constant temptation to go to cruelty. Why do you think that is?
Well, in the case of, and that's essentially two different questions, sort of the overall why do we as humans tend towards cruelty, but why at Abu Ghraib did we tend toward cruelty? I think Abu Ghraib was a disaster from the beginning. The idea of using an old Saddam-era prison, a very oppressive prison. The name Abu Ghraib for most Americans now is associated with the 60 Minutes story. But prior to that, no one had heard of Abu Ghraib. But Iraqis knew Abu Ghraib. It may have the same connotation of maybe an Auschwitz, but certainly an Alcatraz, some kind of intimidating kind of name. And so even imprisoning Iraqis who we suspected of being involved in the insurgency in Abu Ghraib was in itself a form of oppression, a form of maybe not quite torture, but certainly not the way we should have been treating prisoners of war. Prisoners of war should have been moved to the back, to the safety behind the lines, either in Iraq or take them back to Kuwait or Saudi Arabia, move them out of the conflict, make sure that they were healthy, make sure they were well fed, and then you begin. That's where you could possibly get the opportunity to do something like Hans Scharf had done, which is where you start to get to know these guys. The idea of getting to know people while we were under fire on a daily basis at Abu Ghraib, while we were in this famous prison where you could still walk down and see the famous site where they would hang people and torture people. I think that's one of the many things that led to that cruelty. The other issue was revenge was in the air. This was still early 2004. 9/11 was not that long ago. Iraq certainly had nothing to do with 9/11, but I don't think that you can take 9/11 out of the equation in terms of why we invaded Iraq. Many Americans were angry about 9/11, and they didn't necessarily care about the difference between a Sunni and a Shia, or where al-Qaeda had come from, or who the Taliban was. They simply wanted to exact revenge, and I think that's one of the things that you saw in the interrogation booths.
Right. And the there's another thing that happens, and actually happens to you, when, you talk about somebody like Hans Scharf, but when we think of like a real manly interrogation, maybe. You think of Jack Bauer
Sure.
using torture. When you come clean, or maybe not come clean, we can talk about that later, but when you write your first Washington Post op-ed about torture and what you saw
Yeah.
and were a part of, one of the responses that you get is people saying that you're gay.
Yeah. Yeah. The amount of essentially homophobic material in the responses was overwhelming. I knew there'd be frustration. I knew there'd be anger. I did not expect literally the very first email that came in questioned my sexuality. That was it was the least expected thing
And this is not, I remember in the Senate report, one of the groups within the CIA accusing the other of running a quote, sissified interrogation program because they weren't using waterboarding.
They weren't men enough, or man enough. Yeah, absolutely. That was the idea that you would come out of an interrogation without information was intimidating. And if you didn't have the kind of self-confidence that certain types of interrogators had, and maybe too few of us had, you would certainly feel pressured to sort of prove your masculinity by coming out with information. Now, some interrogators were producing. I think you can ask some honest questions about whether or not some of these reports were falsified or whether people were sort of creating information. Certainly false information was coming out of Abu Ghraib. Numerous reports were written about the cooperation between Sunni and Shia and how they were going to rise up and attack the Americans. Well, we know that now to be completely false. But there were a number of reports that came out about that. And I think men in particular, and the vast majority of interrogators were male, not all, but most, certainly the question of their masculinity and their sexuality was something that they feared being exposed by not being an effective interrogator.
Right. I think maybe one of the things that might particularly shock readers reading the book is we expect things to be bad when you're at Abu Ghraib, right? That's what we're familiar with.
Yeah.
By far, for me, the most disturbing things that happen in the book don't happen there. They happen in other places. You leave Abu Ghraib to go do interrogations in Anbar province.
Right.
And you're with a unit. One of the interrogators doesn't speak Arabic and spends a lot of time screaming and breaking things.
Yeah, so he became sort of so the number of detainees at Abu Ghraib was simply overwhelming, and you could interrogate 50 people a day and still fall behind, and we were essentially interrogating 2 people a day. So the idea was that they would send us out to these forward units in places like Fallujah and Mosul and even back to Baghdad, serve with the frontline units. The second these men were captured, interrogate them, process them, and either get them out of the system and send them back home or send them back up for further questioning. And so the detention facility in Fallujah is where I think some of the worst torture certainly that I witnessed, took place.
There's a passage in the book that describes something called the Palestinian chair.
Yeah.
Could you describe what that is?
So we arrived in Fallujah, and like any kind of military arrival, you get essentially a tour of the base and familiar with your surroundings. And often one of the corners of one of the rooms was a small plywood chair, 2 or 3 feet tall, made of 2x4s and some plywood. With some zip ties on it. And one of the gentlemen had asked what it was, and the answer was the Palestinian chair. And detainees were essentially made to sit on this. Their legs were tied behind them. Their hands were then strapped down back to their ankles. And it essentially kind of forced them to crouch down and then lean forward, as if you were forced to be in the permanent position at the lower end of a squat or a lunge.
There's a passage where you describe what this looks like on page 122. Could you read that?
I can, yeah. We pass by the interrogation room where Tyner has been working on Rod Hussein. We haven't heard Tyner scream or throw anything today. The door to the room, a flimsy sheet of plywood, has blown open in the hot desert wind. Inside, Rod Hussein is bound to the Palestinian chair. His hands are tied to his ankles. The chair forces him to lean forward in a crouch, forcing all of his weight onto his thighs. It's as if he's been trapped in the act of kneeling down to pray, his knees frozen just above the floor, his arms pinned below his legs. He's blindfolded. His head has collapsed into his chest. He wheezes and gasps for air. There's a pool of urine at his feet. He moans, too tired to cry, but in too much pain to remain silent. Henson comes out in the hallway and walks past the room. He covers the side of his face and walks by and says, "I don't even want to know. I am silent. This is a sin. I know it as soon as I see it. There will be no atonement for it. In the coming years, I won't even have the audacity to seek atonement. Witnessing a man being tortured in the Palestinian chair requires the witness to either seek justice or cover his face. Like Henson in Fallujah, I'll spend the rest of my life covering my face.
So that, I suppose, leads me to you writing this book. I mean, this, in some ways, this is your attempt to stop covering your face.
Yeah, I'm not sure that there is a way to stop covering my face, but I think there is an obligation that even as I continue to cover it, that I speak out. It's a confession, and it's a necessary confession. It's not a part of atonement. It's not a part of being justified or returned to where I am. It's just simply a necessary step, an obligation as a human to tell my story.
You don't think that you can redeem or some way?
No, well, we can get into a long discussion here about my own sort of religious beliefs. I think I still have ideas about what forgiveness means and what redemption is and how all those things play together, and even the crucifixion. And prior to Iraq, I could have spoken eloquently about all of those things and how they work and how they can work for anyone. But once you take some of these steps, I think you recognize that there is an impotence in some of the ways that we talk about these things. And you can, I believe, perform in a certain way in which you certainly have no right to discuss some of these issues anymore. So certainly the readers and an audience will have an opinion about whether I can or can't be redeemed or forgiven. None of that matters. What matters is my own experience, recognizing just how destructive it was, and doing what I think at this point I'm obligated to do, which is speak out.
This is written in a very stripped down style. There's not a lot of times where you attempt to interpret things for the reader, or you don't try and spend a lot of time explaining why. You seem to simply want to give the facts as they were, the facts that are necessary to understand what's happening, without trying to justify.
Sure. I think like any book, it has a number of different iterations and how it started and where it finished. And I think in maybe some of the early drafts, there were certainly metaphors and similes. Torture is like. War is like. When I was in Iraq, it was like. And I recognized just how powerless those types of words were. Now, this brings us a little bit back to the NYU group. Even as sort of my writing improved, I recognized that the only way to deal with this story honestly was to not make comparisons, was certainly not try to justify any of the actions. In the most recent Republican debate, they talked about waterboarding. Anytime I hear somebody talk about waterboarding, my first instinct is to feel good that I didn't waterboard or witness waterboarding. And I can at some level say, well, at least I didn't do that. Mm-hmm. And if I had seen waterboarding, then I would have spoken up. But I have to resist that urge because I can't say that for sure. Because certainly before I left for Iraq, I would have said if I ever witnessed torture, I'll speak up. I would say something. And then it turned out that my life experience was far different. So it was important for me not to make any kind of justification or any kind of defense, but just sort of lay out exactly what happened.
Do you think that your time, either as a contractor or later working with the NSA in Iraq, do you think that in the aggregate that work did actually save lives?
I think that's a question about sort of the overall effort in Iraq. I think back to the young man who had the car batteries and the discovery of that IED factory in what I believe was Western Iraq. I don't think a rational person could argue that we did not save lives. The discovery of those vehicles and of those weapons and of the men that were likely going to drive them into checkpoints, we eliminated that portion of the war. What exactly happened to that young man, I can't say, but my guess is that he was eventually released from Abu Ghraib and he went back to his neighborhood and had those memories of what took place. And it's almost impossible to say exactly who he became. My guess is, however, that he became very angry and very likely, with his knowledge, started building vehicle-borne IEDs again. He may be someone who's now a part of ISIS. So any accomplishment that we may sort of acquire for ourselves in the interrogation booth with the use of torture certainly spread far more violence in Iraq then it stopped.
So I know for myself, writing about Iraq was in one part for me to make sense of that war, or try and think about it in a richer sense, but a big part of it was also to try and reach out to the American public,
Sure.
who, whether they like to admit it or not, are very much a part of this war, and we went to war as a country, not simply as a military, and the political decisions that we make at home really define what happens overseas. Was the writing of this book a personal effort? Was it cathartic? It doesn't read as cathartic, for sure. Was it your attempt to engage people with these questions that so many years later still don't feel fully addressed?
Sure. Some of the original writing, which I started back in 2006, and I certainly submitted pieces that were not accepted for publication. But there was a much different thought process going on about the war, which I think has changed really significantly in the last 4 or 5 years. But back in 2005, 2006, the idea was that even though there may have been people who opposed what was going on in Iraq, there was universal support for soldiers and for Marines and people that had gone over and served in Iraq. And so it was very difficult to come home and have any kind of discussion that may have suggested that things may not only that they didn't go well for me, but that the overall effort in Iraq, clearly, at least for me, who had been on the ground, was headed in the wrong direction. And so some of my original articles were simply about pointing out that this is not going nearly as well as I think the majority of Americans think that it is. That's hard to, I think, for a lot of people remember back in 2006 because the mindset has changed so dramatically. But as I began to write, so my initial I think, process was just I want to be part of the conversation. I have this knowledge about Iraq. I want people to recognize that it may not be what you think it is. But as I did, I think my own conscience began to kind of eat at me, that I was trying to sort of prop myself up as an expert, as someone who was knowledgeable with a security clearance and Arabic and all the things that make you the subject matter expert. What I was not doing was being honest about how my own behavior had clearly contributed to this failed or this continuing failure in Iraq. The question about catharsis is one I get quite often, and I think most writers, yourself included, probably get this too. Is there something cathartic about writing? There may be for some writers. For me, there was not. It was a daily challenge to sit down and write about these things. And the more I wrote, the more difficult it was. And even you saw some of the early versions of this book, and even you saw some of the evolution, where parts where I still would sort of justify my behavior or say, well, it wasn't necessarily as bad as it was. I had to work very hard to erase those things. And the more I erased that kind of protection by saying that, yes, in fact, I am a torturer and I am someone who tortured, the more destructive it became in my own personal life. So it was not a cathartic effort. Now, you may ask me that question in 20 years, and we may have a different discussion. But I can say honestly that at this stage, no, that the writing process was not cathartic.
It's not personally cathartic, but what do you hope for from this book? You're putting it out into the world.
Well, I think we see every day that what we understood about Iraq, or what we understood generally about war a few years ago, it evolves, right? And we begin to have a better understanding that either what was working well or what wasn't. I think there is very little understanding about the issues of interrogation or about direct contact with Iraqis or Syrians or whoever it happens to be, who these people are. And so my voice is just one. I think naively when I first started to write some of these op-eds, I thought that other interrogators would come out and say, "Yeah, me too." That has not happened, and I'm not sure that it ever will. But I think I was a history major in college, and I respect the idea of honesty in history. And there's a certain excitement when you're researching something and you clearly come across something that's honest, that gives you not necessarily a pretty picture of what went on, or even an intentionally ugly picture, but just an honest picture about what it really looked like to fight in the Crusades, what it was really like to be a revolutionary soldier in a place like colonial America. And so I think that sort of that own background and my own background encouraged me to make it as honest as I possibly could.
Great. Thank you.